Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. So for any of the tools or materials you need to do an oil change, first service, or the gear oil change on any Vespa, we have them all available on the Scooter West web store. So let's get right to it. I'm just gonna go right into the meat and potatoes of this job. I'm gonna do the oil change, and then I'll start talking about the various tools that'll help you do the job successfully, and all the other things you should be checking when you're doing a first service. A lot of people ask for oil change. It's definitely a lot more than just an oil change. So I'm doing this on my own personal Vespa GTS 300 HPE2, as we like to call it, so 2023 and later Vespa GTS. But pretty much all these steps are exactly the same for any of the Vespa 300 motors that have the HPE engine, even the GTS 125 in other markets as well. They have the dipstick in a very, very difficult location to access. If you've owned this up to 625 miles when the first service is due, you've already realized how extra exciting it is to check the oil level on this. And you should be doing that in between. The 2021 and later, they don't tend to burn oil, but those 2020s are certainly oil burners. So the best way to do this is clamp the front tire on something like a lift like this. I've even covered how to clamp a front tire without a lift in the past. And then we're gonna put a jack in the middle to lift the scooter. And as you can see, the muffler header pipe is conveniently located right in front of the oil filter and the oil drain. Just the way they engineered it and designed it, but that's the way it goes with these Vespas. The nice thing is you do that first service at around 625 miles, 1,000 kilometers, and then thereafter, the intervals are actually 10,000 kilometers or 6,250 miles from thereafter. But in my opinion, if you're riding these scooters hard, I would change oil every 3,000 miles. So on the Scooter West web store, we do have a scissor jack like this. Very, very handy for any of the service on a Vespa. It's a tool scooter jack, you can find that. This is pretty similar to the K&L one. So essentially, I have a jack point right in the middle of the frame. I do have a little rubber pad on this. Front's clamped really good. And my techs like to lift these really high, so there's a lot of clearance. So you can see it's all suspended right here. In a pinch, if you're doing this all by yourself, don't have these tools, you can put it on the side stand. You have a friend help you, you can go through the extra steps to remove the muffler to get easier access. Don't do it while it's on the center stand, because otherwise when you drain the oil, it goes right onto your center stand. Good to have an oil pan. I'll cover this later. This is a nice size for a scooter. The all-important 24mm combination wrench is what you're going to need to remove the oil drain. But before you remove the oil drain, I like to remove the oil filter. And you just want to get medieval with it. Just find a set of channel locks, or even better yet, something like this large size Knipex Cobra pliers. These are kind of expensive for do-it-yourselfers, but they're really nice. You'll find them useful for a lot of different things. So right behind this exhaust clamp, I'm clamping onto the oil filter. And this is the way it was from the factory. You can see why I want the clearance of the scooter lifted quite high. So best to do this with the motor a little bit warm. You don't want it blazing hot, because everything's just miserable to touch. And even if you bump a glove on the header or muffler, that's gonna be pretty miserable. But oil definitely flows a lot better when it's warm. If you're doing this in cold temperature, definitely wanna warm up the motor. So I'm spinning the oil filter off by hand. The reason I'm doing the oil filter first is it just gives you a little bit better clearance when you wanna break free the oil drain. So there's your oil filter. You can see I distorted it by using that channel lock on there to remove it. That's the factory oil filter. They typically don't have a nut on them anymore. There is a special tool that does clamp it, a factory tool. I'm not gonna cover that, because generally the replacement oil filters are not that style. Take your 24mm combination wrench. Another option is you can also get a really shallow 24mm socket on a 3/8 drive. That's about the right torque. If you had to really bang on it, it was over torqued. Even though it's a 24mm size wrench to take off this large oil drain nut, doesn't need to be over tightened. So I'll spin that little cover off, and looks like oil. That's about 625 miles. I can tell you one thing, I've checked this oil level a couple times on this 2023, and I have been pretty spirited in my riding when I use it. It was just right in the middle. So it really hasn't burned any oil in 625 miles. Never had to do any top offs. But I'll tell you, even the best engines on two-wheelers, if you're gonna go the full 6,000 miles between oil changes, you certainly wanna check it and top it off as needed. So there's an O-ring in there. Highly recommend you replace that. I'll have the parts a little bit later in the video. I can already feel that's a little squared off, so you don't really want to trust that this reseals. They did use a little grease in there to hold it in place. We'll set that aside, just let it drain. And you got a little bit more than just the oil draining out of that large hole. So we'll use the same Nipex pliers, kind of get them pretty small. Or you can use needle nose. And there's a convenient little tab to pull the strainer out. And I look all the way around the strainer for any particles in here. Oftentimes when they're new motor, you find a couple little particles. There's just a few right here. And I literally just pulled them off with my fingers right there. They're on the tip of my finger. Just a couple particles, very little on this filter. Kind of shows that they engineer or machined the engine pretty good without much debris left behind. If there's a lot of metal particles on this, there might be something wrong with your motor. They're generally really, really clean, but you do want to check it. And as they age, sometimes they'll tear, and that is available as a replacement part. So it's kind of slowly draining. If you want to get every last drop, of course you can just let it sit here as long as you want. But that last small bit of quantity of oil, you know, the volume oil that came out took any of the debris with it. So the small quantities coming out, it's not really all that dirty of oil. If you're real particular and just want to have it all drained out, all to you, let it drain overnight. I like to use these disposable, kind of stronger shop rags. They're pretty handy. Obviously, if you soak them with too much oil, it's probably not the best thing to be thrown in the trash. And just clean everything up. You know, you don't necessarily need to waste a whole can of brake parts cleaner to clean these. And then you want to have a brand new O-ring. So 285536, I think is the O-ring part number. Just drop it right on there. Pretty handy always to have grease on hand. This is the Maxima waterproof grease. Scooter West part number, just grease. Take a little bit of that grease, because a lot of times if it shakes, the O-ring will actually drop right out and it may get pinched. If you put a small amount of grease in there, that O-ring is going to stay in that groove, not go anywhere as we thread it in place. So I would say I'm pretty content with what's drained out of the motor. Make sure the sealing surface is clean. You always look before you thread a drain bolt or an oil filter back on. It's not uncommon, if you don't look, you'll find residue, dirt, an old O-ring from an oil filter that could be left behind, and that could cause some problems. So move our oil pan out of the way. Of course, dispose of that correctly at like an auto parts store. We'll go ahead and put the wrench on here, and you can see it's even not high enough for this long wrench. If you have a short wrench, it even is better, but I'm just having to grab my long one here. So right there, it's just the O-ring's all the way seated. Just go a little bit, just a little bit with your palm, and that's as tight as you have to take that. Go in there, clean this up with a clean rag, and same with the sealing surface for that oil filter. So take your brand new oil filter. Piaggio part number on our Scooter West web store is 82635R-PA. There's several different manufacturers. We only have the highest quality filters here at scooterwest.com. As you can see, this has got the square O-ring and it's already oiled. So if your O-ring is fairly dry, just dip your gloved finger into that brand new engine oil and just go right on to the O-ring here. And there's always been a debate if you want to fill up the oil filter with oil. I used to fill them up, and I kind of come to the consensus you leave them dry is the best thing to do for your engine. So go ahead and thread that on. Obviously look to make sure there's no O-ring left behind from your old oil filter. And if it's a slotted style oil filter, just like this one, we have the Scooter West tool. It's tool OF4, I think it is for the part number for this. It's got like a nice little square chunk on there. And you could just barely get in there to tighten it. Sometimes you may want to loosen the clamp and move this up. If you're a do-it-yourselfer, you may want to invest in the oil filter that's about $1 or $2 more with the nut on the end. Because if that's the case, you can get a 17mm combination wrench and tighten it. So with the clamp out of the way, you get better access to that slot. And just like the oil drain, you definitely want this more than hand tight. And that's the idea of the T-wrench. And the thing with the slotted one is the tool will want to cam out if you're over tighten it. Right now I just have it pretty tight. You could pretty much seat the O-ring and go typically another half turn on the oil filter. Different O-ring designs for those oil filters are a little bit different. And then you can just swing that clamp down. Obviously this is cool to touch right now, so we're safe here. So don't get too far ahead of yourself. Got to put oil back in the motor. Sometimes you get so excited you drain the oil and you just accidentally start the motor. It's not a good thing. From here I like to put the center stand down because you're going to get the most accurate oil level check with the center stand, the front tire down on the ground. So these dipsticks are very fragile. I've had a lot of people say, guess what, I broke the dipstick off in the engine. Oh my gosh, I got to rebuild the whole motor. Well, I've investigated. You break this tip off, it ends up going into the oil sump. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't hurt anything. Yeah, it's really inconvenient because you got to go buy a new dipstick. You can see it's pretty fragile on this tip. If I give it a little flex, it will break off. But it's really easy. You're trying to put this in at an angle will break that tip right off. So, and of course, when this is all hot, it's extra exciting to be dropping in. So what you want to do is you kind of got to feel your way around. Going like an angle like that is not the correct direction. I kind of have you put oil in there, but the correct place that the dipstick goes in is you kind of start on the outside of the hole and it drops right in. If you have it pointed in any angle like this, it gets jammed up, you know, on the components inside the motor. So pull the dipstick to the outer edge right there and it drops right in. So just a little tip before we get too far and start filling the oil. A couple ways to fill the hole. I can tell you one thing, you're not going to have very good success just trying to pour it in that hole. Not very good design there. It's really, really tight. Here in the service department, I have a metered gun tied to a 55-gallon drum that the service techs use to fill up these oil, and it literally takes like 5 seconds to fill it up. But a do-it-yourselfer is probably not going to do that. A couple ways to go about it. On the Scooter West web store, we do have these red line oil funnels. What you could do with these is they have a tip. This tip's actually not aimed right, but you could heat up the tip. I've covered it in a past video, and you can get it to a point where it works just like this. There's not really too many small funnels that fit in there successfully. Option 2 is to find a much larger syringe than this. They do exist, and you could squirt the oil in, you know, suck it out of the oil. But actually I had a customer kind of say, you know, the best way to fill the oil on these things is pull the bucket. So you pretty much open the seat, pull the bucket out, and we'll go ahead and lower the scooter and I'll show you what I'm going to do. I had a customer tell me the best way to fill up these scooters is just through the top. So bucket's out. I have this flow tool transmission oil and gear oil spout, and it's mainly for cars where you got transmission oil in weird locations. It threads on the top of most bottles. Sometimes they come with adapters. Doesn't thread on the top of this Castrol Power 1 bottle that well, but I want to use that Castrol Power 1. So the second way you could go about this, and the cool thing, it does have the little thing that clicks it on off, is just find a vinyl hose. Could be from that spout if you want it. Find just a regular standard funnel. This is just a quick fill, regular funnels, ironically also made by Flow Tools. The rubber hose is really nice. And at this point, go right down there. It's got a nice little tip. And the funnel's not gonna flop and fall down. We know we need about 1.3 liters of oil. This is a quart of oil, so it's not quite a liter. It's about 950 milliliters, 946 milliliters. So see how fast I'm doing that? Make sure you don't overflow the funnel. And it's just a nice clean job. And probably do the best thing for the environment. I would let these drip, get all the oil out of there so you're not throwing oil into the landfill. So is where I'd like to start just to see where I go. So I got this full bottle. Of course, you're gonna need a second bottle. And the best thing you do in oil change is you have the remnants of a bottle to do either your next oil change or just have oil on hand to top off your oil. So most of them have a foil seal here. Make sure foil seal doesn't drop in. And you got the clear graduations on the side. I'll go a little bit below 750. So adding about a quarter of this bottle into the crankcase here. Might give it a couple little shots. And that should get you really, really close. So I'm just a tiny bit under 750. Put that cap on there, you don't want that spilling. And at this point, once it's all drained in there, you may have a little residual oil. You could fold that right up so you don't have too much drip. And there you go, nice clean job. So you can see there's still a little bit of oil dripping through. So this might be a bit much if you want to carry oil on your scooter. You could certainly make a contraption, have a real small funnel and a little rubber hose, make for a nice, easy, handy tool to top off oil if you're doing a road trip. I would probably put it in a plastic bag with some of these rags just to soak up any residual oil that comes off it. Oil dipstick in from the back and drop it down. And if you go in any angle, it doesn't quite want to drop in. So, and typically I'll just thread it in a couple turns because I do want to verify the oil level. So at this point I have the key fob there. I'm going to turn the engine on. You may want to look at the oil light. I always like to take a peek at the oil light right when you start it because you do want it to extinguish right away. And we're going to go ahead and start the motor. And I know it built up oil pressure right away. I heard the motor was minus all this rattles, but I heard the motor quiet up within literally like 2 seconds of startup. So, you know, pretty much fills that oil filter right up. And even more important is taking a little test ride, double check, make sure there's no leaks underneath your oil filter, and then double check again after 100 miles. So at this point, pull the dipstick out, kind of let the motor settle with the cold oil in there. Wipe the dipstick off. And the way these work is you drop it in, thread it almost all the way in right when the O-ring seats. Definitely not the most convenient design, but that's the way it works. Someday I'll show everybody how to put the old style belt cover on these in the old oil pan because it is actually compatible. And right now I just checked it, it's right at the low mark. So I still need to add about, I would say about 150 milliliters of oil. And you're never gonna get a good reading if you just drop it in like that. So let's add about another 100 milliliters of oil. That's probably right about there. So I've used about 1/3 of the bottle, I'd say. And let's drip in there. If you have any drips on any of the components, just go ahead and wipe them off. If you get oil on a muffler, you're definitely gonna smell that on your test ride. So go ahead and pull the funnel out. Another way that this kind of store this is just in your oil bottle for just temporary. Obviously don't want to knock over the oil bottle, but kind of keeps that hose from dripping all over the place. And there you go, it's perfect. It's right up to the high mark there. So at this point, go ahead and thread the dipstick in. Another newbie issue on a Vespa. Sometimes people don't thread it all the way in. It eventually will vibrate out and you will end up with a blast of a ton of oil on everything. So go ahead and tighten it. Just snug it where you feel the friction of the O-ring seating onto the case there. If the scooter's higher mileage, it may be a good idea to replace the O-ring or the complete dipstick that includes a new O-ring, just so it stays in place. Can't hurt to have an extra dipstick on hand. They're pretty inexpensive. All right, so next we're gonna drain the gear oil and change out the gearbox oil. So in most of these automatic Vespas, they have a final reduction gearbox. First service, they specified changing this gear oil out because it does have some metal debris that may build up. There's no magnet or any sort of filter in that system. Generally, you never lose any of that oil unless there's a leak. So not too much reason to really ever check it unless you're just doing a top off or you see a leak. And the easiest way to drain it into something is you don't want it draining onto the wheel. I'll show you shortly. You want to cut your old oil bottle, so the empty one, cut it to be a shape similar to this. You know, it's something like a sharp razor blade or a nice pocket knife. You can whittle it just to this shape. So that's a nice homemade tool, real easy to do. You got to keep that oil off that rear wheel. You know, otherwise, if you're going to end up with a disaster and end up oiling your tire and the wheel. So right here, my left hand's holding my homemade drain cup, and I'm looking for that 6mm Allen right there. So I have a nice long extension on the Allen. Takes a little bit to break it free. So there we go. And just the idea is you're unthreading it and you're prepared to catch the oil before it starts draining onto the inside of your wheel. So I'll show you what's going to come out shortly. So now the drain plug's off. I see the copper washer. I just felt it drop into the pan. And right here, you're just going to hold tight and allow the oil to drain. So here I have a new copper crush washer. The part number from Scooter West is 000397. And you want to drop that right onto the bolt. So I'm kind of multitasking right here. I'm holding my my pan, kind of watching it. It's still flowing out pretty good. I'll wait till it's just a small trickle. And I have my Allen, my long Allen key all loaded, ready to go to put the oil drain back in. And all these same steps apply pretty much to all the Vespas. They use a similar setup. The only difference, the 50cc is on the other side or in the back of the motor. The 150cc, 125 motors is very similar to this. All right, it's just down draining to a trickle, so we'll go ahead and thread the needle in the haystack right here. And make sure you don't cross thread that. And I'm still holding the funnel just to keep any drips out of the wheel. I don't like to drip oil on my wheels and tires if I don't have to. Put your socket back on. If you want to torque that, about 15 foot-pounds. I just feel the washer kind of seating. Pull that out, and there may be a little drip in there. You can get your rag. It's got the brand new crush washer, and we have drained gear oil in here. All right, so you're gonna need 80W90 gear oil. Of course, these bottles are enough to do several changes, like probably 6 changes. We have the Eni, which is an Italian supplier of oil. It's Oil Gear-A. That's available. It's got a much larger cap. So you may want to use something like this tool syringe, which is a 60 milliliter syringe, and you can stick it inside the cap and pull the oil out. Alternatively, we have the Multiple product, the Gearbox oil, and it's Oil Gear 80W90M. And another product we have is the Gear Minis. They're just small ones, a single serving size. So if you know you're not going to be doing this job again, why have all this extra oil around? So that's also an option. Pretty much just search gear oil on the Scooter West web store. So at this point, you want to pull the dipstick off. And it's sometimes pretty tight. They do have a nice little square at the top of the dipstick if you need to get a little wrench on there. And sometimes the O-ring will get stuck in the hole. So pull it out, and I'll carefully take a brand new rag and I'll kind of just wipe around there because there's always a little dirt surrounding that. Sometimes people think they got a leak around here, and it's just a minor oil weep. That's not really a problem, but obviously want to monitor it. If it looks really wet, then you may have an oil leak from one of the hub seals back here, the gasket. Not too common, but it does occur sometimes. Don't want to lubricating your tire or brakes. But there's really no reason to check this in between intervals. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Multiple gearbox oil, and the reason I think this works the best for my application right here is it's got a pretty convenient oil spout, and maybe this bottle will come in handy if you want to fill your engine with oil, because there's actually has a little bit of bend to it. You could, you know, repurpose it. Can't really hurt. So we're just going to go in here. You could look at this. I'm going to add about 150 cc's. This is truly a 1 liter bottle, so we'll bring it down to 850, the level. So just kind of be careful, but you could kind of just squirt it in just like that. And it's a little hard to see through here, especially with the blasted light. Kind of let it settle. Can't quite see it. There's probably a tiny bit more, but the best way to get the correct oil level is use the dipstick. And let me show you how this works. A lot of people don't understand this dipstick. So there's a little dot almost at the very tip. That is the correct level. It's just only one level to have it at, and it's at the lower dot. Ignore all those other graduations on the dipstick. It works just like the engine oil dipstick. Thread it in, almost all the way in, pull it out, and let it settle. And it's just barely at the tip, so I definitely need to add a little bit more. And this is nice and clean. The syringe works very clean as well. And let it settle for a second, because sometimes it's dripping down the gears. So it's right there at the dot, and that's the perfect level right there. And that's all you need. If you go way up the dipstick, you're going to end up with an oil leak out the back. So there you go. That's all you need to do the gearbox oil. And now you still have a whole bottle for several more changes of gearbox oil. So you still have most of a whole bottle to do more gear oil changes down the road. So maybe at 12,000 miles, 24,000 miles, which also corresponds with about 20,000 kilometers. Don't need to change it much, just lubricating a couple of gears in there. All right, so now that I showed you how to change the engine oil and gear oil, pretty straightforward, but there's definitely some tricks to it. Let me show you all the products and tools that you need. So first of all, you need the engine oil, 5W40 JASO MA2. You're going to need 2 bottles of this if you're doing this at home. I recommend the Castrol Power 1. We have this available on the Scooter West web store. It's very popular oil. That's at a good value price point for a full synthetic oil that's compatible with this motor. Next, you're going to want to have the O-ring for the drain plug, and that's 285536 is the Piaggio Scooter West web store part number. You're going to want to have an oil filter on hand, 82635R-PA. There are alternate variations of that oil filter. If we have the one with the nut on the back, it may be a better filter if you're a do-it-yourselfer, because you could just tighten the filter with a regular wrench, and same with removing it. Now going on to the tools needed for doing oil change. Pretty important to have a 24mm combination wrench. It's not something that comes in a standard toolkit. Unfortunately, this one's pretty large. A shorter one's going to be to your benefit. They do make nice shorty ones. We have some in the service department. I happen to grab the long one. Doesn't need to be snap-on. In a pinch, you can also do it with a 24mm shallow socket on a 3/8 drive ratchet. If not, if you don't have those tools, you're going to be removing that muffler, because you're not getting a 1/2-inch 24mm socket on there with the muffler header pipe in the way. Next, you got to get medieval on that oil filter. Best way to go about that is the Knipex channel locks, just like this, or just regular channel locks. Or alternatively, you could use the oil filter tool to remove it, especially if it already has a nut. Many of the oil filters use the T-slot, like the one we installed. We do have the special tool for that, Tool OF4. It's got the nice little slot and a T-handle. Works pretty good. gets just the right amount of torque on that filter. Next, you want to have a good oil drain. You can use a bread loaf tin, but if you're looking for a nice specific pan that works perfect for the scooters, Tool oil pan. It's a nice blow molded oil pan, works really good. Has a nice little spout to drain it. Pretty popular item here at scooterwest.com. Moving on to filling the oil. Well, I can tell you one thing, you're not going to be able to pour the oil in with just the regular bottle. Several ways to go about it. You can get a very large syringe. You can get the red line oil funnel and bend the tip. I've covered that in a past video. And then you have an oil funnel just outside the bodywork to fill up your oil. One of the best ways I found out is get something like this, a transmission fluid and gear oil spout. And it's got an on-off spigot. As long as it threads onto the oil bottle, you could fish this right through the top and fill the oil with no issues. If you're looking for a low budget version of this that works better and doesn't rely on threading on the top, find some vinyl tube just like this and right on the spout and thread it right in. And that works really good. Moving on to the gear oil. Of course, you need gear oil. You don't need much of it. We have several different brands of the ADW90 gearbox oil. It does not need to be synthetic, but you can use synthetic. It's pretty difficult to find synthetic ADW90. You're going to need to cut this oil bottle just like this, and this is going to make your perfect tool for draining your gearbox oil. Pretty important to have a 6mm long Allen key. You can have it on a ratchet like this. I got an extension, a long Allen key, and this nice gear wrench ratchet works really good. You don't necessarily need to have real nice stuff, but these are pretty fine quality ratchets for a budget price. You could probably get in there with an L key. Not gonna have much luck, I don't think. And pretty important to have the crush washer when you remove the oil drain for the gearbox oil. So 000397. Like I said, there's more to a service than just dropping the oil and refilling it. We're gonna go over and inspect the rest of the scooter. Pretty handy to have a T25, a T30, and a number 2 Phillips screwdriver on hand. And oftentimes you may need to top off the coolant. Even in between oil changes, I'd recommend checking it every once in a while. If you have the factory coolant in the engine, they do recommend changing it every 2 years. We do have this available. It's Cool-Motor-X. It's the exact chemical specification of the original coolant. It is possible to change the coolant chemistry if you do a complete flush, but I've covered that in other videos. And you're wondering how to remove that coolant cap. Tool SN, it's actually a fork bearing tool for tightening the fork bearings. It works really good for removing the cap on these Vespas. All right, so I want to be official about doing this first service. I'm going to go by the factory specified service chart. Now I have this all blown up for my service techs, and I'm just going to go by it one by one and show you everything else you'd be checking. All the boring checklist stuff that you should be checking every time you ride the scooter probably. So first of all, the most important thing, almost more so than checking your oil level, is topping off your tire pressures or checking them. They may be overinflated. I'm checking them cold, so I'm gonna have a pretty accurate pressure. I'm using the Scooter West Tool-Air. It's just a nice handy little handheld pump. They're very close to the right pressure because I did check them about a week ago, so it lasts a couple days, about a week ago, so it lasts about half PSI. And you could set the pressure and it stops at the set point. Real handy to use. I use it actually in the service department. You know, we have shop air. A lot of times customers ask to have their air pressure checked, and this is easier than dragging a hose out in the street. Also important to look at the tread of your tire. If you have a penny head, you could do the penny head trick. 625 miles, unless you're doing burnouts, the tire is probably still going to be in good shape. If you're wondering what an average tire lasts on the rear of a Vespa GTS, it varies greatly. The city grips I've seen anywhere as little as 3,000 miles for somebody who's on the highway and rides really, really hard all the time, to as many as 9,000 miles where somebody's very easy on the scooter. Typically, it's kind of in between there, about 5,500, 5,000, 6,000 miles, about what you get. But I like to look at the tires, especially if it was alarmingly low. I'll look for something like a nail in the tire. I'll maybe spray it with some light soapy water, see if I could find a leak. Unfortunately, a lot of times scooter and motorcycle tires is probably not the smartest or safest idea to patch them. You know, your whole life is pretty much riding on these tires. They're in great condition, still lots of tread. I don't see any like cuts or anything that is alarming. And you can even look for the tread wear indicator. Moving on to the front, pretty much same steps, except for your pressure is going to be a little bit lower. I like to run about 26 PSI. The other cool thing about this pump, these new GTS wheels have some really close spokes to where the tire valve is. And so it's really hard to get some of the different various chucks on there, but I find this little one works good. You just thread it right on there, and let's see where we're at. Lost 1 PSI, so not much at all. And while you're looking at the tires, you want to check all your lug nuts there. You may even want to retorque them. Check for the cotter pin on the rear axle. It's kind of hidden and nestled just behind that muffler. That's pretty important to check. Look at your brake pads. You can physically see in there. I can look in there. I see the material behind the metal plate of the brake pad. I can visually see that it looks like there's about 4 or 5 millimeters of thickness, about 1/8 inch, somewhere in that range. Plenty of life left on these brake pads, but if this metal plate is really close to your rotor or you see any scoring in the rotor, you may need to be servicing the brakes. Same with the rear, it works pretty much the same. You can't quite see the pad as well. But that's pretty much what you want to check when it comes to wheels. Give it a little rotation. I take it on a test ride here. If I hear any bearing noises that are whirling that go with the road speed, that could be a wheel bearing going out. Generally, they're very, very robust on these Vespas. I don't see too many problems with the front hubs, wheel bearings. Make sure there's no free play. Give the motor a wiggle, especially when it's cool. If you have it off the stand, I'd look at these engine mounts right here on both sides, especially when they're high miles. I mean, just a good habit to start checking all this stuff, even though the scooter's brand new, just to kind of know what it looks like. Look at these coolant hoses for any weepage. Again, nestled right behind the muffler is the weep hole for the coolant pump. So if there's a coolant leak that's internal inside the coolant pump, it usually will leak right out there. Sometimes it won't. It actually will end up contaminating your engine oil with coolant. And that's something you're maybe looking 15 years down the road, or maybe if you have like 30,000 miles, those are some of the issues you make, service points. But like I said, a good idea to check them. So just staying around the engine area, a couple other things, just like popping the hood on a car, pull the bucket out of your scooter frame. And we're gonna look at a couple more things under here. Everything looks perfect to me, just doing a quick visual glance. Again, you have more coolant junctions. That's your thermostat right there, and you have some bleed hoses. You can see they put yellow dots on everything from the factory. One thing I like to check is this your throttle body. Give it a rotate. It should wiggle a little bit, but it shouldn't be loose. Sometimes you do have to tighten these clamps as the rubber kind of shrinks up from heat cycles. Check your fuel line. That's your fuel line going right here. It's a high pressure fuel line designed to last the life of the scooter. It's all clamped on here pretty good. That's your injector. I just look at all this stuff. Look for oil leaks around your valve cover gasket. Check the spark plug cap. I don't necessarily, with these NGK spark plugs, they're pretty good. You don't necessarily need to remove it on the first service, but make sure the cap's in place. The 2020 and later, it's quite a robust design. The ignition coil's kind of tucked behind here on the engine, so you don't have a wire flexing like those old models. So a pretty nice design. I check all this wiring here, make sure it's still in the clamps. Sometimes you'll find a clamp looks like that. See, the clamp will pop off, or maybe they didn't secure it at the factory. I'd find that stuff and then push it right back in. Look at all these clamps and make sure wires aren't rubbing, on areas. Everything under here looks perfect. This ironically is my own scooter's serial number 0. Of course it's perfect. It's the first one they made for the North American market. Okay. So the last thing I always like to check is make sure the seat latch is working good. A lot of people slam the seat down. The seat may need alignment. which is done with those 2 bolts. Here's the latch. Right now it's unlatched. It's not banged up because I'm pretty careful when I close the seat over to 625 miles. I've used this scooter in the last 6 months. Just try it out. So you push it down, and then you can push the release and see if it works. It's a perfect time, you know, put some type of lubricant. I'm using a Worth HHS Plus, but there's other types of kind of clear, you know, sticky lubricants that spray out of a can that will do the same thing. It's just going to work a lot better with that. And then the last thing you want to do is check your throttle free play. So while you have the motor open, you want to check your throttle free play. That is perfect. There's just a little bit there. So if you do need to make an adjustment, you have 2 cables at your throttle body. The top one is your push cable. You generally don't need to mess with that unless you're disconnecting the cables. The pull cable is the one that's going to take your slack out. And the way it works is you loosen, I'll show an example on the push cable. Is not the one you're going to adjust. Is take a 10 millimeter, break the lock nut free, and then 8 millimeter, or your fingers to loosen or tighten this, and then tighten the nut up against the adjuster. So no adjustment needed on here. You can see the whole mechanism's turning very freely. So no issues there. I don't see anything else that looks like it needs attention under here. We'll move up to the front of the scooter. All right, so pretty obvious one. You should just, if you're doing it yourself, you should know that all your switches and lights always function. Pretty important. You should be checking that every ride anyways. Make sure all your lights work. Nice thing about these scooters, they have all factory LEDs, so they're all designed to last the life of the scooter. Moving on down, you got the brake fluid level. You could look at this right through here. No reason for it to be low, especially when you have new pads in there. The brake fluid does slowly evaporate away. On these scooters, they do recommend flushing that brake fluid within 1 year of ownership. They kind of shorten that interval. One of the issues, sometimes they do have a little bit mushy brakes, and I've showed how to bleed these. Sometimes I like to also spray the lubricant into the brake lever pivots. I like when the brake levers feel real smooth. Kind of a sticky, clear grease is good for that. But pretty important to check even in between services. Occasionally check your coolant level while it's cold, because it's so tucked away. A lot of people just ignore it. And, you know, even if you don't have a leak, these have a lot of soft rubber lines and junctions, so they tend to just lose a little bit of coolant over time. So you have the radiator cap. The scooter's nice and cool. If it's loose, you could do it by hand. You know, and that was tight enough where it's not leaking. And I'll look down there, and look at that. It's right at the minimum level. So, and that's not unusual. It could be in between the minimum and maximum, but while I'm at, let's just bring it right up to the maximum mark. You definitely don't want to go over the maximum mark. On a hot day, you're going to end up with some coolant on your lap, and it's going to be quite a big surprise, because this tank is engineered for the coolant to expand when it gets hot. So the Cool Motor X is ready to use. It's the correct formula that mixes with the factory coolant. Just pour it in there. Usually I have my flashlight on me. I kind of blew it and didn't bring my flashlight. I like to shine it, and you can really see the level. And almost right there, just it doesn't take much to bring it from the minimum to the maximum mark. So nothing to be alarmed at. Even if it's a little bit below the minimum, there's still quite a bit of coolant capacity down below. If the coolant reservoir is all the way dry, that's when you should be alarmed. Put the cap back on. Threads on like such. That's your pressure cap. And if you want to give it a little tightening, that tool SN, it actually happens to fit. Just give it a little bit. Doesn't need to be over tightened. And there's even some notes in there. Don't burn yourself. Use the right coolant, and so on. So the last physical check, I'd also pull up the battery cover here. I would say every couple thousand miles, even in between services, not a bad idea just to inspect your battery. You don't need to necessarily do a test. If it's cranking the scooter over nice and strong, probably not going to have any issues. So I'm using a T25 Torx driver to pull up the 4 screws on the center mat here. So the 2 things I like to check most frequently, see if they're loose. See that? That's too loose. And they will loosen up because the posts are made out of lead on these batteries. So you want to take your Phillips screwdriver This is being a very fresh new scooter. It's not any of the corrosion. If I saw corrosion on there, I'd clean it up. I would put some dielectric grease. You know, I'd use a wire brush any of that corrosion off. Because a lot of times people have intermittent weird problems, and it comes down, it's just the battery. If you're wondering what that fuse is, that's your main fuse for the charging system. And you check the strap, which is a T30. So both are pretty tight. Go ahead and replace that missing clip right there. If you're ever looking for one of these clips, the factory part number is a CM017410. Pretty inexpensive little clip, just snaps on. Sometimes it's a good idea just to replace them. They get a little bit stripped out, you know, after you take the screws out, in and out, you know, a dozen times or so, or over tighten the screws. Go ahead and put all the screws back in. And you may be asking what the last things we'd do. We'd take it on a road test, kind of feel how the suspension works, how the engine performance, see if there's anything just feels abnormal. Nice thing when a service center does a first service, the techs working on these here at Vespa Motorsport, they ride these things every day, so you can feel the nuances about, you know, if there's some issue with it or feels a little bit different. The road test, you know, in a service center isn't just a joyride. It's to kind of feel if there's any potential issues that maybe the owner won't feel. So being an owner of the scooter and self-servicing it, you should just be hyper aware of little changes on your scooter. Sometimes it could just be a normal inherent little rattle that just comes with the age of the scooter, but you know, maybe a bearing noise or a suspension issue. So there's definitely one thing you're not going to be able to do as a do-it-yourselfer. As everything gets more technologically advanced, just to give you a hint, the scooter has several microprocessors. It's got the ECU for the engine control and traction control. It's got an ECU for the ABS. It's got you know, a microcontroller in the dashboard. It's got a microcontroller for the keyless. All those systems are very, very reliable, but they sometimes can be glitchy. So sometimes they come up with software updates, you know, firmware updates for those modules. And unfortunately, you need to have the factory tool to do that and take it to a service center. So here at our dealership, we plug this in, it's completely wireless. It ties a computer. We could check for any updates, any errors on the system, along with resetting that pesky service indicator wrench. So that service indicator wrench, it comes on first at 625 miles or 1,000 kilometers, and then thereafter every 6,250 miles or 10,000 kilometers. So I'm going to turn the scooter on. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So see that little wrench? Right now it's just flashing. My mileage is 619. I'm not quite to 625. So I want to see if there's any chance I can reset that thing. I don't think you can, but pretty much the way you reset it, you set that to voltage, so you click to the left until you're at volts, and then just hold the center button for about 10 seconds, and it will eventually reset the service indicator. So there it is, it's reset. It allowed me to do it even though it was flashing. It's a little bit before 619. So now that service indicator has been reset until 6,250 miles from the current mileage. That's when we'll see that indicator next. Pretty handy, just reminds you that service is due, but fortunately you don't need the special factory tools, electronic tools to reset that. So put in volts and then hold until it resets. It says service coupon reset. So I promised the last detail, other than checking the mirrors, checking the hardware on your accessories and so on, all the stuff you should be doing anyways occasionally. Vespa Motorsport, we've always put next service due at stickers underneath. So I'll wipe off the mileage, which was 625. Like I said, 6,250 is your next real service, but I would say 3,000 miles and 1 year. So, you know, August 24, you know, 2024 would be the next service. So if you don't hit the mileage, that's when I take it in, and you know, technically it'd be due for the brake flush. Well, thanks for enjoying that whole journey with me. Did you ever think I'd talk about an oil change so long? there's so much more to it, especially if you're coming onto this for the first time to check out a scooter. Have people asking for oil change. They're really, more or less, on any two-wheeler, it's usually a service, and sometimes a major service, and less miles than you would think. But thanks for watching. It's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. Check out the next video. I'm going to talk about this scooter, my thoughts on it after owning it for several months in 625 miles, and how it compares to the older models. I'll see you in the next one. Robot here.